For thousands of years, this city remained intact. Not because it was protected, not because it was reinforced, but because it was left alone. Beneath layers of soil and sediment, Mohenjo-Daro stood quietly, untouched by weather, untouched by time. When it was uncovered in the 20th century, the discovery shocked the world. A planned city, advanced drainage, standardized bricks. A civilization that had solved problems many societies struggled with thousands of years later. By every definition, this should have been a success story. And yet, within decades of being exposed, the city began to change. Walls weakened. Bricks cracked. Entire sections started to fail. Not because of war, not because of neglect, but during efforts to preserve it. This raises an uncomfortable question. How could a city that survived 4,000 years underground begin to deteriorate only after we found it? What exactly changed when humans stepped in? The answer is not mysterious. It is not hidden, and it does not involve legends. It lies in a decision we rarely question. That discovery must be followed by exposure. That preservation requires access. That to protect something, we must first reveal it. But at Mohenjo-Daro, the problem did not begin when the city was buried. It began when we decided it should be seen. Before it was discovered, Mohenjo-Daro was not a forgotten city. It was a city at rest, buried but stable. For thousands of years, the layers of soil above it acted as a natural protective system. They insulated the walls from rain, from sunlight, and from wind. Temperatures remained relatively consistent. Moisture levels changed slowly. The city was not frozen in time, but it was not being damaged. The structures here were built from fired bricks, bound together with mud mortar. These materials were never designed to endure fully exposed conditions. They performed best when surrounded by soil and stillness. In that state, Mohenjo-Daro preserved itself. No repairs were needed. No reinforcement. No human intervention. The problem was never the city. The problem only appeared when that balance was disrupted. When Mohenjo-Daro was uncovered, the decision to excavate was not controversial. This was the early 20th century, an era defined by discovery, by documentation, and by the belief that knowledge should be brought to the surface. Archaeologists did not arrive to dismantle the city. They arrived to understand it, to record it, and to protect it. Excavation was seen not as interference, but as preservation. To study a city, it had to be exposed. To preserve it, it had to be accessible. Walls were uncovered. Streets were cleared. Structures were mapped and stabilized. Each action made sense on its own. Each step was taken with care. At no point did anyone believe they were placing the site at risk. The assumption was simple, that a city which had survived for millennia could survive being seen. But the moment the soil was removed, the environment changed. And the city entered a condition it had never been designed to endure. Once the soil was removed, Mohenjo-Daro was no longer underground. It was now exposed to air, to sunlight, and to rainfall, conditions it had not experienced for thousands of years. This was not a sudden shock, but it was a fundamental change. Beneath the surface, the environment had been relatively stable. Temperature fluctuations were limited. Moisture levels changed slowly over long periods of time. Once exposed, the city entered a new cycle. Wet, then dry, repeated again and again. A cycle its materials were never designed to endure. There was another factor, less visible but far more destructive: groundwater. Water moved upward through the soil, carrying dissolved salts with it. As moisture reached the surface, it evaporated. The salts remained. Salt crystallization does not look dramatic. There is no immediate collapse, no sudden failure. Instead, crystals form inside the bricks and within the mortar. They expand slowly, silently, exerting pressure from within. Over time, the material begins to fracture from the inside out. This process repeats itself after rain, after heat, after each wet-dry cycle. Damage accumulates even when, from the outside, nothing appears to change. What once functioned as a stable system now required constant intervention. The city was not deteriorating because it was ancient. It was deteriorating because the conditions around it had been fundamentally altered. When signs of deterioration became impossible to ignore, human intervention did not stop. At Mohenjo-Daro, multiple conservation measures were introduced, not once but repeatedly over many years. Walls were reinforced. Weakened bricks were replaced or secured. Protective coatings were applied to reduce direct exposure to rain and sunlight. Drainage systems were modified. Channels were reopened. The goal was to control moisture and slow the process of decay. Each measure was technically justified, and in the short term, many of them worked. But the results did not last. After each heavy monsoon season, portions of the protective layers were washed away. After periods of intense heat, new cracks appeared. Areas that had been repaired began to deteriorate again. A pattern emerged. Intervention. Temporary stability. Then renewed damage. Over time, preservation was no longer about maintaining the original condition. It became a continuous effort to slow deterioration, rather than to remove its underlying cause. The more measures were applied, the clearer one difficult reality became. Each intervention, even when intended to protect, made the city increasingly dependent on constant human presence. Mohenjo-Daro could no longer sustain itself. It required monitoring, maintenance, ongoing repair. And this led experts to begin asking a critical question. If a site can only survive through continuous intervention, is it truly being preserved? Or is it simply being held in a fragile state, one that cannot endure on its own? By this stage, it had become clear that continued exposure carried a cost. Despite repeated repairs, despite protective coatings, despite constant monitoring, the site continued to deteriorate. At Mohenjo-Daro, the question was no longer how to preserve the city while keeping it open. The question became whether keeping it open was the problem. Each new intervention reduced the margin for error. Each repair increased dependence on future repairs. Stability could be maintained, but only temporarily, and only through constant human effort. At the same time, extreme weather events became more frequent. Heavier rains, longer heat waves, conditions that accelerated the very processes the conservation work was trying to slow. This forced a difficult reassessment, not of the city itself, but of the approach. If exposure was the source of ongoing damage, then protection might require the opposite of access. This is where an alternative began to gain serious attention. Not abandonment, not neglect, but controlled covering. Selective backfilling. Reburial is a form of preservation. The idea was not to erase the site, but to return vulnerable sections to the stable conditions that had protected them for millennia. For many, this felt counterintuitive. Discovery had always been associated with visibility, preservation with access. But the evidence suggested something else. That in some cases, the most responsible way to preserve a site was to limit how much of it could be seen. And for the first time, stopping was no longer viewed as failure. It was considered a necessary decision. In archaeology, reburial is not a careless act. It is a method, with a name, with procedures, and with a clear scientific basis. Backfilling, or controlled reburial, involves placing soil, sand, or neutral material back over excavated structures to recreate a stable environment. The goal is not to hide a site. It is to protect it from conditions that are causing ongoing damage. At Mohenjo-Daro, this means reducing exposure to rainfall, limiting wet-dry cycles, and slowing the upward movement of salt through the brickwork. When a structure is reburied, temperatures around it become more stable. Moisture changes occur more gradually. environmental stress is distributed more evenly. In other words, reburial does not make a site disappear. It returns the site to the conditions under which it remained intact for thousands of years. This is why most archaeological sites around the world have never been excavated. Not because they lack value, but because excavation always carries risk. In many cases, leaving a site untouched is the most effective form of preservation. For Mohenjo-Daro, reburial has been considered as a selective solution, applied only to the most vulnerable areas, places that cannot be kept stable under permanent exposure. This approach does not reject research, nor does it close the door to knowledge. It simply acknowledges a limit, that not every heritage site can be preserved, fully exposed, and continuously accessed at the same time. In some cases, true preservation requires stepping back, not out of fear, but out of understanding what is causing the damage in the first place. This city did not disappear because it was forgotten. It survived because it was left underground. It did not begin to fail until it was exposed in the name of preservation. That is the paradox Mohenjo-Daro leaves behind. That our instinct to protect can become the very force that puts something at risk. So the question is no longer whether we can excavate or whether we can preserve. The question is whether we can accept that some places endure longer when we choose not to touch them. Because progress is not always measured by how much we uncover, but by knowing when to stop.